The 7Artisans 50mm f1.8 is a full-frame autofocus lens with a surprisingly great price. But is it a great lens? Let's find out. So 7Artisans have sent me this lens to review ahead of its release in March this year, and I've been testing it for the last couple of weeks. So in the box with the 7Artisan autofocus 50mm f1.8 for full frame, you can see here that it comes packaged in a nice white and red box with all the information you'd need on that. And looking inside, we have a USB-C cable, which I imagine will be for firmware updates, the manual, and under the protective foam, and here is the 7Artisan 50mm f1.8. Straight away out of we have the plastic lens hood with a 0.5 meter or 1.64 minimum focus distance with a 62mm filter thread. And there we've got autofocus 50mm again. On the rear, we can see that large element for a full frame, as well as the electronic connection for autofocusing and that USB port, which we're seeing more and more frequently for firmware updates. We've got a plastic petal-shaped lens hood. And the element is actually quite flat. I'm not sure if that's definitely flat, but it looks pretty flat. And is metal construction mostly. And we even have an autofocus and manual focus switch, which you don't see that frequently anymore, but is always quite useful. So the aperture ring here is the smaller one, closer to the body, and that really has quite a firm travel, so that you're not going to be knocking that by accident, but it is not notched. I'm always quite a fan of it being notched. And there we go from the auto, go all the way from automatic to 16, all the way down to the widest of f1.8. And the focus ring is not as stiff as the aperture ring, but it's still not going to knock that by accident, and it's got quite a smooth kind of feel to it. So it feels quite premium, quite weighty. I'll give that away later. But yeah, very premium feeling lens of quite a decent size. That's not going to be a super travel friendly lens. But for that super wide aperture of f1.8, it is a very impressive piece of kit. So as you can see from all the example videos and photos in this video, the image quality with this lens is crisp and sharp. The images are in fact very sharp in the center, only losing a bit of that around the edges, which of course is fine and happens with way more expensive lenses than this. Now, the 50mm focal range of this lens does make it maybe a little too wide for landscape photography, unless you are looking for a much more punched-in style of shot. But where this lens excels is for portrait photography. 50mm is a nice focal range for professional-looking portraits. It provides good subject separation and smooth background blur. The chromatic aberration is fairly minimal from the test shots that I've taken, with very little discolouring even around the edges where you would normally expect to see it, which is quite a pleasant surprise for this lens. The sharpness of the images, as I've mentioned before, is good, especially in the centre of images. Now, whilst it definitely tails off towards the edges of shots, and that's even on narrower apertures, the centre of shots certainly is sharp enough for high quality portraits. Now, as this is a full frame lens, if you wanted to use it with an APS-C camera, it gives it an effective focal range of 80mm, so quite a bit tighter than 50mm and worth keeping in mind. And for more lens and camera reviews like this, please subscribe to the channel and drop a like on the video, as it helps me out a lot. Okay, so now let's look at the autofocus performance of this lens. And it focuses pretty quickly.
finding the focus without too much effort and with very little focus breathing. Now, the autofocus motor isn't silent, emitting a quiet, high-pitched noise, but it isn't anything too distracting, but is worth bearing in mind while taking video. If you're changing focus, you might pick this up on your microphone. Also, the minimum focus distance is 0.5 meters or 1.64 feet, which is worth bearing in mind too, as it means you can't be too close to your subject and still get focus. Also on the lens is a switch to swap between auto and manual focus mode quickly, which is always a nice to have. Now let's talk about the bokeh and depth of field that you can get with this lens. Due to the focal length of 50mm and the wide aperture of f1.8, it makes an ideal combination for bokeh and out of focus backgrounds, which in hand makes a great pairing for portrait photography. The bokeh itself is very smooth and has a swirly kind of dreamy effect, which is maybe a little distracting to some, though I think it looks quite pleasant. Now, the subject separation between the subject and the background as well is very good, making for shallow depth of field shots look very striking. And now onto the low light performance of this lens. That wide aperture again of f1.8 makes it great for low light photography. You can shoot in the dark or indoors when it's poorly lit and still keep your images looking pretty visible without having to pump up the ISO too much. This basically means you can get good quality shots without too much grain on your images, which is always a bonus. And when you're using this lens for video, it's worth remembering that it doesn't have in-lens stabilization built in, so you will be relying on either the stabilization of your camera or a gimbal to reduce shake. This is especially important if you are moving around with your camera while taking video, as it will make things look less professional if it's shaking. And the video performance overall is quite good with this lens. I do feel like it looks a little softer compared to photography, not achieving quite the same levels of sharpness, but to be honest, it still does look very good. So I mentioned at the start, this lens has a good price, and the good news is this lens is touted to come in at around $200, which is quite a lot less than I was expecting from a lens of this quality. So if you're looking at a capable, low-budget lens for portraits, then this lens is a good option. Now, this lens is slated for release in March this year, so you'll need to wait till then before being able to pick it up. Overall, though, the 7Artisans autofocus 50mm f1.8 is a great full-frame option considering its price. It's a fine prime lens option for $200, with a good autofocus system and sharp images, which is a solid performer for portraits. For $200, this lens is well worth the money. Are you looking forward to this lens and are going to pick one up? Let me know in the comments below. But as always, if you've enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel and dropping a like on the video. But until next time, see ya.